Imagine yourself in 18th century Virginia. Your neighbor is a brilliant polymath, philosopher, architect, scientist, and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He champions liberty, equality, and natural rights with an eloquence that echoes through centuries. He seems like the ideal visionary, doesn't he? But what if I told you that this same man, Thomas Jefferson, the founding father who proclaimed that all men are created equal, owned hundreds of slaves? How do you reconcile this monumental contradiction? Life next to Jefferson wouldn't just be an intellectual privilege. It would be a daily confrontation with the paradoxes of a nation's founding. How do you grapple with the mind that dreamed of freedom but lived off slavery? Prepare to unravel the layers of one of the most complex figures in American history. Are you ready for the truth behind the myth, and why you most certainly would not survive it? Imagine waking to the first rays of sun, bathing the rolling hills of the Virginia Piedmont, the fresh morning air carrying the sweet perfume of magnolias and the earthy scent of freshly plowed fields. From the window of your modest property, you observe the routine of your neighbor, a man whose presence seems as orderly and monumental as the neoclassical mansion he himself designed and raised on the mountain's summit, Monticello. Thomas Jefferson is the living embodiment of the Enlightenment, a true Renaissance man transplanted to the New World. He is the imposing intellectual, the visionary architect, the amateur scientist whose curiosity knows no bounds, and a gentleman of such refined manners that his company is sought by diplomats and philosophers alike. His dinner conversations are legendary, true symposiums where everything from the metaphysics of Aristotle to the latest innovations in botany and agronomy is debated. He is, at first glance, the neighbor any aspiring citizen of the new republic would dream of having. His correspondence is a river of ink connecting him to the most brilliant minds in America and Europe. And his library, with its thousands of volumes, is a sanctuary of knowledge that he sometimes generously opens to select visitors, eager for a glimpse of his intellect. You see him riding across his vast lands at dawn, a figure of discipline and purpose, meticulously inspecting every corner of his plantation, from the wheat fields to the nail-making workshops. He is a widower who projects an image of fatherly devotion to his daughters, a man who writes with overwhelming passion and crystalline clarity about the inalienable rights of man, the tyranny of monarchy, and the beauty of self-governance. His public facade is flawless, a monument to reason, virtue, and the promise of a nation founded on liberty. However, as the days turn into weeks and the seasons change the color of the landscape, you begin to notice subtle dissonances in the seemingly perfect melody of Monticello. His routine is precise, almost military in its execution, but this precision is not merely the fruit of his personal discipline. It is sustained by a vast and complex human machinery, an invisible and silent workforce operating in the shadows of his greatness. The people who maintain the immaculate beauty of the gardens, who serve the aged French wines at his elegant dinners, who cook his meals, who weave the textiles, and who endlessly build and rebuild the wings of his ever-evolving mansion, do not share in the freedom he so eloquently extols. They are hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, whose lives are as rigidly controlled and catalogued as the plants in his botanical garden. There is something profoundly unsettling in the way the sound of forced labor begins, even before the first crow of the rooster, and only ceases in the deep darkness of night. A relentless and exhausting rhythm that serves as a somber counterpoint to the philosophical discussions on liberty that echo from Monticello's porch. You notice that the people entering and leaving the estate are not all distinguished guests or free artisans. Many are brought in chains, their families torn apart at auctions that Jefferson himself sometimes oversees or orders through his overseers. The smell wafting from the slave quarters, hidden from the view of the main house, is not one of prosperity, but of a life of deprivation. The man who champions the pursuit of happiness as a universal right is the architect of a system that systematically denies it to hundreds of individuals under his absolute dominion. The perfection of Monticello, you begin to understand, is a carefully constructed optical illusion, a beautiful facade built upon a foundation of brutal oppression and abyssal moral contradictions. The perfect neighbor reveals himself to be a complex and disturbing enigma, whose true nature is infinitely darker and more complicated than his enlightened reputation could ever suggest. Life next to Monticello unfolds under the weight of a constant duality. But it is in the details of the estate's daily administration that Jefferson's mask as a benevolent philosopher begins to crumble, revealing the cold, calculating face of a relentless master. The most emblematic act of his fundamental contradiction is not a single, spectacular crime, but a continuous, methodical, and deeply ingrained system of dehumanization, operated with the precision of a scientific experiment. Consider the story of Sandy, an enslaved young man who, driven by the universal desperation for freedom, flees from Monticello. Jefferson's reaction is not that of a thinker who pauses to contemplate the poignant irony of a man seeking the very liberty he himself declared a natural and inalienable right. On the contrary, he transforms into an efficient manhunter. He mobilizes his network, publishing detailed advertisements in newspapers like the Virginia Gazette, offering a reward for the capture of his fugitive property. He describes Sandy with the same cold, dispassionate precision he would use to catalog a new plant species in his botanical journals, listing his physical features, his clothes, and his skills, all to facilitate his recovery. When Sandy is finally recaptured, the punishment is a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, calculated to serve as a terrifying example to others. Jefferson avoids the public spectacle of the whip, an act that could tarnish his reputation as a gentleman and humanist among his peers. His violence is more subtle, and perhaps for that reason more devastating. He sells Sandy, sending him to the Deep South, a fate universally feared by all of Virginia's enslaved people, who saw it as the equivalent of a slow, brutal death sentence, an exile to inhuman labor camps, far from his family, his community, and everything he had ever known. This is not an isolated act of a man driven by anger. It is his established modus operandi, a management style based on the cold logic of profit and absolute control, where human beings are classified as assets to be managed, punished, leased, or liquidated to ensure the order, discipline, and maximum productivity of the plantation. This brutal truth manifests in every corner of your life as a neighbor, becoming impossible to ignore. While you listen to Jefferson's eloquent discourses on the sacred importance of family unity as a pillar for the stability of the new republic, you also hear the muffled laments coming from the slave quarters at night. As a mother is forcibly separated from her child, sold off to pay one of Jefferson's many and mounting debts, he kept meticulous records in his farm book, a ledger where the birth of an enslaved child was noted not as a human event to be celebrated, but as an increase in his capital, an asset that appreciated over time. The incessant metallic sound you hear coming from the nailery on Mulberry Row is not that of a virtuous enterprise of free artisans, but the sound of the forced labor of boys, some as young as 10 years old, compelled to hammer iron for hours on end in suffocating conditions of heat and smoke. Those who failed to meet their demanding daily quotas felt the sting of punishment, usually the whip, applied without hesitation by the overseer. Your perspective as a neighbor transforms the abstract horror of slavery into an immediate, visceral, and personal reality. The man who, in a gesture of intellectual generosity, lends you a rare book on freedom in ancient Greece, is the same man who, without flinching, orders the pursuit of fugitives with dogs and armed men. The hand that pens inspiring letters on the inherent dignity of the human condition is the same hand that signs the order to sell an entire family to cover the costs of his imported wines, his scientific instruments, or his architectural experiments. The mask does not fall in a single dramatic moment of revelation, but rather disintegrates slowly, piece by piece, with every child you see toiling in the fields under the scorching sun instead of playing, with every face marked by silent fear and chronic exhaustion, with every sound of suffering that the wind carries from the service areas of Monticello, revealing that the enlightened champion of liberty was, in his own home, the meticulous and uncompromising master of a private gulag. Thomas Jefferson's power was not confined by the fences of his plantation. It radiated throughout Albemarle County and indeed all of Virginia, creating an ecosystem of fear and deference that made any challenge to his authority almost unthinkable. As a neighbor, you would quickly learn that your survival depended not just on avoiding his direct displeasure, but on navigating a world where his influence was omnipresent and the local power structures were, in essence, an extension of his will. The authorities who were supposed to ensure justice and order were in practice his peers, his friends, and in many cases, men who depended on his political and economic patronage. The county sheriff, the local judges, the members of the militia, they all belonged to the same class of landowners and slaveholders. They shared the same economic interests and the same ideology that upheld the institution of slavery. To report an act of cruelty at Monticello would not be seen as an act of virtuous citizenship, but as a betrayal of your class and a threat to the established social order. The law, which Jefferson himself helped to shape, was a tool to protect property, and in his worldview, the people he enslaved were precisely that, property. Going to a magistrate to complain about the treatment of an enslaved person would be the same as questioning a man's right to discipline his horse or manage his livestock. The response would not be justice but ostracism, economic ruin, or worse, being labeled as a radical abolitionist, a dangerous pariah in a society built on slave labor. This systemic control generated a palpable climate of fear that infiltrated the community's daily life. A complicit silence hung over the region. Neighbors learned not to see, not to hear, and above all, not to speak. You might see a column of smoke rising from one of Monticello's workshops at an odd hour, or hear a scream cut through the stillness of the night. But conventional wisdom dictated that you should mind your own business. The unwritten rule was clear. Survival depended on your ability to ignore the contradictions that flourished all around you. To question the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence was to question the very foundation of America, an act of social and political heresy. Furthermore, Jefferson's public perception was incredibly complex and well-managed. To the outside world, to his correspondents in Europe, and to political leaders in other states, he was the Sage of Monticello, an American philosopher king. He cultivated this image with great care, publishing his thoughts on liberty, religion, and governance, while the mechanisms of his oppression remained conveniently hidden in the Virginia hills. This duality made the situation even more dangerous and confusing. How could you convince anyone that the man hailed as one of the greatest champions of human freedom was, in his private sphere, a tyrant? Your word, that of a small landowner, against his, a titan of politics and intellect, would carry no weight at all. To live next to Thomas Jefferson meant living in a distorted reality, where the noblest words about liberty served to mask the practice of the most abject tyranny, and where the entire community was complicit, either through fear or self-interest. In maintaining this deadly facade, every empire, whether built of bricks and cannons or of ideas and paradoxes, carries within it the seeds of its own ruin. For Thomas Jefferson, the crack in his fortress came not from a slave rebellion or a legal investigation, but from an enemy he could never fully subjugate, the truth, fueled by his own monumental debts. Jefferson's fatal flaw was his inability to reconcile his aristocratic tastes and grandiose projects with the economic reality of his plantation. Monticello, with its constant renovations, its library of thousands of imported books, its French wines, and its scientific experiments, was a bottomless pit of expenses. He lived perpetually on the edge of bankruptcy, a state of precarity that made him even more dependent on forced labor and the sale of human beings to stay afloat. This financial pressure forced him to intensify production and extract the maximum from his enslaved people, making conditions at Monticello increasingly harsh and further belying his image as a benevolent master. The investigation that finally exposed the depths of his hypocrisy was not conducted by detectives, but by journalists and political rivals like James Callender, who in 1802 published the accusation that Jefferson kept one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, as his concubine. The allegation, though used as a political weapon, cast an uncomfortable light on the reality of life at Monticello, revealing the abuse of power that occurred behind closed doors. Jefferson's capture was not with chains, but with the consequences of his own actions and ideologies. The trial he faced did not take place in a courtroom, but in the court of history, and in the brutal reality of his financial legacy. After his death on July 4, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the mask finally disintegrated completely. He died drowning in debt, an amount so colossal that his heirs were forced to make a devastating decision. To settle his accounts, they auctioned off almost everything: the land, the furniture, the art, and most tragically, the people. In January 1827, more than 130 men, women, and children who had lived, worked, and suffered at Monticello were placed on a platform and sold to the highest bidder. Families that had remained together for generations, under the tenuous stability of Jefferson's rule, were permanently shattered. The man who wrote of the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness left as his final legacy the complete destruction of the life, liberty, and happiness of the hundreds of people he controlled until his last breath. His final days were not those of a tyrant defeated in battle, but those of a man haunted by his creditors and his contradictions. He spent his final years trying to secure the foundation of the University of Virginia, another monument to his idealism, even as his domestic empire, built on slavery, crumbled. The end of his reign did not bring justice for the enslaved, but rather the final and most cruel consequence of his system, their dispersal and mass sale, the ultimate proof that, to him, they were never anything more than property. To understand the depth of Jefferson's moral abyss, one must look beyond his philosophical publications and delve into the most intimate documents of his life, his family records and farm diaries. In these books, written in the same elegant hand as his political treatises, we find not a family man or a humanist, but a meticulous manager of human capital. The farm book is perhaps the most revealing document. In it, Jefferson does not just record harvests and expenses. He catalogs people. Each birth of an enslaved child is noted with the coldness of an accountant. Under the column Increase, he calculates the value of his enslaved workforce, estimating that a healthy child represented a 4% annual return on investment. This language of accounting, applied to human lives, transforms the tragedy of slavery into a spreadsheet of profits and losses. Families, which he publicly championed as the foundation of society, were in his private records mere production units, subject to being divided and sold to maximize efficiency or to cover the cost of a new set of porcelain dishes from Paris. The story of the Hemings family, in particular, exposes this contradiction in a devastating way. Sally Hemings, his concubine and the half-sister of his late wife, and the children he had with her, lived in an existential limbo. They were his children, but also his property. They were his family, but also his slaves. This sick duality is the core of the Jeffersonian paradox. He promised Sally Hemings that their children would be freed upon reaching adulthood, a promise he kept, but only in his will, ensuring that he benefited from their labor for his entire life. The remainder of his life after the presidency was a continuous performance of this contradiction. He retired to Monticello, positioning himself as the American sage, an oracle of liberty to whom intellectual pilgrims traveled. He received countless visitors, discussing the highest ideals of humanity, while just a few yards away, hundreds of people lived without any basic rights. His final years were consumed by two major projects: the creation of the University of Virginia and the management of his crushing debts. The university was his utopian vision of an academical village, a place for free inquiry and the advancement of knowledge. However, the very construction of this institution was carried out by enslaved laborers, some rented, others from his own property. He designed a temple to the freedom of the mind, built literally on the backs of chained men and women. At the same time, his financial situation became increasingly desperate. He resorted to loans, mortgages, and inevitably the sale of more people to maintain his lifestyle and fund his projects. The anxiety of his debt reveals the bankruptcy not only of his finances, but of his philosophy. The man who dreamed of a republic of independent yeoman farmers was himself trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, a cycle fueled by the very institution that he, in his more lucid moments, recognized as a moral abomination and a wolf we hold by the ear. To live next to Jefferson in his final years would be to witness a man slowly drowning under the weight of his own creations. A mountain of debt and a legacy of oppression that contradicted every word he had ever written about human freedom. Living next to Thomas, Jefferson was a brutal and silent lesson. Evil, or the capacity for oppression, rarely presents itself as a monster. More often than not, it wears the face of reason, sophistication, and progress. It smiles, offers you a book, and discusses philosophy, all while building its personal paradise on the unseen suffering of others. Jefferson's story forces us to look beyond the grand facades and eloquent words, reminding us that the most dangerous contradictions are the ones a society chooses to ignore. Stories like this remind us that we must look beyond appearances. If you are also fascinated by the darker corners of history and want to unravel other complex figures who have shaped our world, join our community of truth seekers and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of evil hiding behind a charismatic facade, Jefferson's story shows how a single man can create a system of total control within his own home. But what happens when that control isn't based on physical chains, but on psychological manipulation so powerful it turns young people into killers? In our next video, we're trading the hills of Virginia for the deserts of California to explore a different and even more terrifying form of tyranny. Click here to discover why you couldn't survive living next to Charles Manson.